All right, good morning, everyone. My name is Mitch Liester. I'm a psychiatrist from Monument, Colorado, and I'm here to talk with you today about ayahuasca and near-death experiences. I'd like to just find out a little bit more about the audience. Can I see how many people have heard of ayahuasca before? Almost everyone here. Good, so that's a good starting. Can I see how many people, if you're willing to say, have tried ayahuasca? A few people. Okay, good. So that gives me an idea. Let me give you a little background about how I came to talk about this topic, these two seemingly disparate ideas. My personal background is that I was born in Kansas. My parents were farmers in western Kansas, and when I was a year old, my father got a teaching job in Colorado, so we moved to Colorado, where I grew up, Colorado Springs. Spent many summers back on the farm in Kansas, riding tractors, pickup trucks, helping with wheat harvest, and I had a grandfather who was a very deeply spiritual, religious man, I would say, and he loved his grandkids more than anything. I have over 50 first cousins, and he would always have us riding around in the back of his truck when he was out on the farm. And one day when I was a child, he was out feeding the cattle and had several of my cousins on the back of the truck, and as he was backing up the truck to feed the cattle, my cousin Bruce fell off. And unfortunately, his head fell under the back wheel of the truck, and my grandfather didn't know this, so as he was backing up, the truck crushed my cousin's skull and he died. This was devastating to my grandfather. Like I said, he loved his grandchildren more than anything. And for years after that, he kept a picture of my cousin Bruce up in the corner of his living room as sort of a memorial to him. It was a very devastating event in my first experience with death. When I was in medical school, many years later, I got a phone call from my grandfather, who insisted that I come and see him at the local hospital in Tribune, Kansas. He said, something very strange has happened to me, and everybody thinks I'm crazy. But I'm not, and you need to come see me. So being in I think it was my second year of medical school, when I had a break over the weekend, I drove back to Tribune, Kansas, which is about a 3-hour drive. And I said, okay, Grandpa, what's going on? He said, well, the first thing you need to do is look at my hospital chart. I told the nurses it's okay, so go look at the chart. So I went in and looked at his medical record and saw an EKG that showed he'd gone into a rhythm called ventricular fibrillation, which is a rhythm of the heart where it's not pumping blood. And that he had come out of that rhythm. So I went back to his room and said, okay, Grandpa, so I saw your medical record, what's going on? He said, well, everybody thinks I'm crazy, but I'm not. He said, I'll tell you what happened. He said, I was lying here in bed after having an accident on the farm, and what had happened, he had been out plowing in the fields, pulling a disc plow, and the plow had become plugged up with weeds. So he went back and climbed on top of the plow and was pulling the weeds out when he lost his footing. And he slipped and came down, and his chest hit the wrought iron bar on this plow. And being the stoic Kansan that he is, he got back in the tractor and kept plowing for the rest of the day. But later that night, he said to my grandmother, you better take me to the hospital, I can't breathe. So she took him to the hospital, and they admitted him for a cardiac contusion, which means a bruise of his heart. And while he was lying there that night, he had an unusual experience that he didn't understand. He suddenly felt himself floating about in his body up to the ceiling, and then he went through the ceiling and through this long tunnel and into this very bright light. And in this bright light, he saw his mother, who had already died, as well as my cousin Bruce, who was the one who had been killed in the accident many years earlier. And he was so happy to see them. And they were actually planning his funeral. They were picking out songs for his funeral, he told me, when this being of light came and told him he had to come back. And Grandpa was a Methodist. He went to the Methodist church every Sunday. And he didn't say in his description that this was God or Jesus. He just said it was a being of light that insisted he go back. And my grandfather started arguing with him. He said, I don't want to go back. I like it here. I feel wonderful. But he said, no, your life's not over. You have to go back. And he felt himself falling back through this tunnel, falling back into his body. And when he opened his eyes, he saw the nurse and doctor standing over him. And his first words to them were, what'd you do that for? And they misunderstood his question, thought he was asking him why they'd just given him the intravenous lidocaine to get his heart started again. And when he tried to explain, no, I'm not talking about the medicine, what did you bring me back for? They assumed he was delirious, as the medical term for confusion. And told him, no, you're going to be fine, and kind of patted him on the shoulder and went on about their business. Well, when he told me this story, I really didn't know what was going on either, because as a medical student, I was trained to have a scientific view of things. And I thought it was possible he was hallucinating, although my grandfather never hallucinated before. It's possible he was delusional, but he seemed clear in his consciousness. And I did remember that as an undergraduate, I had worked in a hospital and heard some of the nurses talk about experiences that were similar to this when people were resuscitated. So I said, well, Grandpa, I'm not sure what happened to you, but I'll go back to the medical library and see what I can find. So I went back to Denver to the University of Colorado Medical School, where I was a student, and went to the library and was stunned to find a lot of medical research papers describing near-death experiences. And after that, I became very interested in these kind of experiences. Found a book called Life After Life by Raymond Moody, sent it to my grandfather. Grandpa said, you know, I've never read a book in my life. He had an 8th grade education. He was a very successful man, but not an educated man. He said, but I'm going to read this book, and he did. He said, that's what happened to me. So subsequently, I became interested in near-death experiences and had the good fortune of running into several other people who had had near-death experiences. I did my residency at UC Irvine, just up the highway here a little bit. And while there, I met a librarian at the UC Irvine Medical School who had been a teenager in Europe when she was hit by a car while riding a moped, had a near-death experience. One of my fellow residents, Paul, I can't think of his last name right now, had a previous life as a fisherman in Alaska. And in Alaska, when you go fishing in storms, you tie, in those days, you tied a rope around your waist, so if you got washed overboard, they could reel you back in. Well, he had been washed overboard and was in the sea for 30 minutes before they got him back in. So I kept encountering people that had near-death experiences, and I became more and more fascinated with them. Fast forward many years later, in 1997, I was doing some research, some psychiatric research, about the difference between hallucinations and visions. And this came from sort of an unusual experience I had where I sort of began hearing a voice in my head. I know that sounds strange coming from a psychiatrist, but I started hearing voices. And the voices told me to write about inner voices and the difference between hallucinations and visions. At that time, I hadn't done any writing. I didn't know the difference, and I didn't want to do it. I didn't like writing. English was my least favorite subject in school. But the voice wouldn't leave me alone. It would wake me up at night. I'd hear a knock on the door, and I'd go down at 3 in the morning, and there's nobody at the front door, and then I couldn't sleep. So finally, I started researching and trying to learn about inner voices. And a friend gave me a book during this time called The World is As You Dream It by a gentleman named John Perkins. And John Perkins was a man who had been down in South America in the 70s with the Peace Corps when he had a very profound experience. He had been sent down to Ecuador to help people develop a banking system in the rainforest. And when he arrived there, they just laughed at him. Because not only did they not need a banking system, they didn't use money. They were a barter system. So he decided just to hang out there and learn from the people. And one day he became deathly ill, and someone came to him and said, "Are you ready to go now?" He assumed they meant that he was going to be taken into the jungle to die because he was too far into the jungle to get out. And where they actually took him was to work with a healer, a shaman. And the shaman worked on him, and he was miraculously healed, and he was very grateful. He said, "What can I do to help you?" And they said, "Well, we really don't need your help. We're fine here. What we really need from you is for you to go back to the United States and tell your people how you're affecting our people, because your way of life is destroying our way of life. The oil companies are coming in, drilling oil wells, destroying the rainforest. Good meaning people have brought cattle into the rainforest. The cattle are destroying the rainforest. They just mow it down." So John began taking groups of Americans down to South America to learn about the indigenous way of life and the healing methods there. So when I read John's book, it talked about these healers that heard voices for helpful purposes. So I called up and said, "John, I want to learn more about this." And he said, "Why don't you go to Ecuador with us?" So in 1997, I packed my bags and headed south to Ecuador, having never been to South America or Ecuador before, thinking I was going to be learning about inner voices. What I discovered as I was going down there is there was also a medicine known as ayahuasca that is used by healers in South American jungle, and they use it for a variety of healing purposes. And we had the opportunity to experience ayahuasca at that time. I will say that it was, that whole trip was a very life-changing experience for me. I don't know that I'll have time to go into all the details, but that was my first personal introduction to ayahuasca. And what I realized through that experience is that there are many similarities between near-death experiences and ayahuasca experiences. Ayahuasca is a Quechua word. Quechua is a group of ethnic people who live throughout South America. It's the largest indigenous group anywhere in North or South America. And Quechua is both the name of their culture and their language. And Quechua means, it's interpreted differently, or excuse me, ayahuasca is interpreted differently as vine of the soul or vine of death, because when people ingest ayahuasca, they have experiences that are very much like a death. And in fact, people have been using ayahuasca in South America for thousands of years. It's sometimes used for healing purposes, sometimes used for divination. Let's say you've lost something or someone who's important to you. People will ingest ayahuasca and have visions to obtain information about where their lost object or family members may be. It's also used for intuitive purposes. I have a friend who I met after returning from Ecuador who's from South America. He's a healer. His name is Rafael Yamberli, lives in Santa Fe. And I asked him, "Rafael, when did you first ingest ayahuasca?" He said, "I was a young boy, and my father and I drank ayahuasca." I said, "Why did you drink it?" His father's also a healer. He said, "Because my father was ill and we didn't know if we should go see a shaman or a medical doctor. So we both drank ayahuasca." And I said, "What do you see?" He said, "We both saw that he should see a medical doctor, so we took my father to a medical doctor and he was healed." So it's used for different purposes. This is a very interesting medicine in that it's a mixture of two different plants. As you can see here on the left, the one plant that's used to prepare ayahuasca is Psychotria viridis. The leaves from this plant are picked and harvested. The second plant is Banisteriopsis capi, which is a vine-like plant that grows in the jungle. And thousands of years ago, it was discovered that these two plants, when blended together, could make a very powerful medicine. Now, when people are asked, how did this happen? How did they discover this? You get very different answers. If you ask Western scientists, they said, well, probably trial and error. They probably just went in and tried mixing different plants together until they found this concoction that worked. But if you ask the people who used the medicine, they said the plants taught them. The plants spoke with them and explained to them how to use these plants. And the way this medicine is prepared is that the vine-like plant is cut and then chopped into small pieces. The bark is often peeled off and it's cut into woody strips, and it's like a wood plant. It's put into a large pot with the leaves from the other plant. And then water is added and it's cooked over a fire for hours. All day long this medicine is cooked. And it's distilled, the water is evaporated off, until eventually all that is left is a very nasty tasting, thick brown liquid, very bitter. It tastes like dirt to me. I don't have very discriminating taste, but it does not taste good. And so you may wonder, why would anybody drink this muddy tasting plant? Oh, I forgot to add, after drinking it, you do experience a little bit of nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea, as well as a little vertigo, so it's not something that people tend to abuse. But people drink it because of the visions it produces. So for those chemists in the group, I want to talk just a couple slides only about the chemistry of ayahuasca, because it's actually quite fascinating. The ingredients that are believed to be the active ingredients of ayahuasca are a combination of two different chemicals. One is called DMT, or dimethyltryptamine, and you can see it on the top left there. DMT is a very interesting chemical in that it is considered to be a Schedule I drug by the FDA. The Food and Drug Administration says this is a drug that has no medicinal uses whatsoever. It has a high abuse potential, and therefore we're scheduling it as a Schedule I, similar to many other psychedelic medicines, cannabis, LSD. Interestingly enough, DMT also is a natural substance found throughout the plant and animal kingdom, and each of us have it within our own bodies and our own brains. So it's a natural substance that we all have within us, and it's also a Schedule I substance, which is quite an intriguing paradox. So as long as it's in our brains, we're in no trouble. But you take it out and carry it, you can get arrested for felony for carrying this DMT. Normally, if you ingest DMT orally, if you swallow DMT, there are enzymes in your intestines and stomach that will break it down. They're called monoamine oxidases. These are enzymes that will destroy the medicine so it doesn't get absorbed into your bloodstream. But interestingly enough, when you mix these two plants together, the second plant contains a group of chemicals called monoamine oxidase inhibitors, which are the other chemical structures that you'll see here. They're called beta-carbolines. They have 3-ring structures with a nitrogen group, and these block the enzymes in the gut that break down the DMT. So now when you ingest the DMT, it becomes active. It is absorbed in the bloodstream, travels through the system, and has very powerful effects on the gut as well as the brain. So how did they find, again, these two plants, that one contains the enzymes to prevent its breakdown, the other that has the psychoactive properties? Depends on who you ask. DMT is also very similar structurally to serotonin. Serotonin is another chemical that we all have in our bodies. It's most predominantly found in the intestines, but also in the brain. It's the basis for many of the antidepressant medicines we use in psychiatry, the SSRIs, or selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, things like Prozac, Zoloft, Lexapro, Celexa. These are all medicines that increase the levels of serotonin. And you can see there's only a very slight difference between the chemical structure of serotonin and DMT. Okay, that's all the chemistry. So what are the effects of ayahuasca? Well, I mentioned earlier that it has some physical effects. After ingesting it, 20 to 30 minutes later, people often feel somewhat dizzy, lightheaded perhaps. The nausea begins, vomiting begins, and people often have repeated vomiting during the experience, also diarrhea. It can go on for hours. Those are not the pleasurable side effects, although we call them side effects in our culture. In many indigenous groups, they're considered important side effects, or effects, not side effects, important effects. It has a purgative effect. It's a way of releasing and discharging things that aren't healthy for us. Sometimes it's used to discharge parasites, perhaps in the GI tract and gastrointestinal tract, or releasing negative energy, or bad energy that's within us. Well, one of my former professors, who's here in Los Angeles, Charles Grobe, who's now at UCLA Harbor over in Long Beach. At the time I was doing my residency at UC Irvine, he was the director of child and adolescent psychiatry at Irvine. He was from Brazil and Finland down into the jungle of Brazil to do a study called the Huasca Project. Huasca is another name for ayahuasca. There are many different names for it depending on which ethnic or cultural group people are in or what language they speak. And there are 3 churches in Brazil that use ayahuasca as part of their religious ceremony. It's a sacrament. And in these churches, people drink ayahuasca regularly for the visions it produces. One of these churches is the UDV, or Union, I don't speak Portuguese, but it's the Union of the Vegetable. It's a church that's a syncretic blend of the Amazonian indigenous tradition and Christianity. And people on a regular basis drink ayahuasca for the visions. What's interesting is the UDV church is now spreading around the world. It's found in the United States as well as many European countries, Africa, Asia. And the Supreme Court ruled a few years back that when used in a religious context, ayahuasca is now legal in the United States. So there are people who are drinking it here in the US. There's a church in Boulder, Colorado, and I don't know all the other locations, but I know many cities throughout the nation now are starting to have UDV churches. So you may be hearing more about ayahuasca. And so Dr. Grove and his colleagues went down to Manaus, Brazil, and studied members of the UDV church to find out what were the physiological and psychological effects of ayahuasca. And they performed both blood analysis on 13 members of the UDV as well as 10 controls. They also performed neuropsychological testing. This is kind of extensive testing that you do with a paper and pencil, not with x-rays or blood, that determines things like the personality of the individual, any psychopathology or mental illness, those kinds of things. And their findings were quite interesting. What they found is that the people that ingested ayahuasca regularly were actually mentally healthier than the control group. They couldn't explain why that was the case, they just found that was true. And a secondary finding was that they found an increased number of serotonin binding sites on the platelets of the members who drank ayahuasca regularly in the church. Now, platelets are what we have in our bloodstream that helps clot blood, and we have serotonin receptors there. For some reason, the ayahuasca produced an increased number of binding sites for serotonin. The extrapolation of that finding was perhaps the same thing as going on in the brain, but they didn't test that. They weren't doing brain biopsies. So there are certainly some physiological effects of long-term ayahuasca use, but they seem to be positive, not negative. A second individual who studied the effects of ayahuasca quite extensively is an Israeli psychologist by the name of Benny Shannon, who has spent time throughout South America as well as Europe studying the phenomenology of ayahuasca, what effects come from it. He's written a book called The Antipodes of the Mind. It's quite a fascinating book. I don't think it's here at the bookstore, but you can get it online. I'll leave that slide up there for a moment. He's gone into probably more depth than anyone I've ever read about the effects of ayahuasca. So if that's something you're interested in, I would highly recommend his book.
How do you spell his last name?
S-H-A-N-O-N.
S-H-A-N?
Yes, Shannon with one N in the middle. And so what I want to do as we move forward is look at what Dr. Shannon has described as the phenomenology of ayahuasca. And he investigated it again in many different settings. And one of the things that's important about this type of medicine, we're talking about psychedelic medicines, what used to be called hallucinogens, but that term has fallen out of favor because they really often do much more than produce hallucinations, is the setting in which the medicine is used has a profound impact on the effects of it. I've found that to be true myself. I have drank ayahuasca on 3 different occasions, and each time I had a vastly different experience. Again, so what's beneficial about his study is that he looked at indigenous users, shamans using it in South America. He's looked at people using it in Europe, and tourists that use it in South America to see if their experience varies for the shamans or indigenous use. And basically, he described that the effects of ayahuasca can be broken up into 4 different categories: perceptual changes, emotional changes, cognitive or thinking changes, as well as transcendent experiences. Now, the next few slides, I want to highlight these or explain a little bit more, and you'll also see pictures. The pictures are paintings or drawings of individuals who have taken ayahuasca, and they have made these paintings or drawings in an attempt to depict what they experienced. So the perceptual changes include hallucinations. As a psychiatrist, we describe a hallucination as when a person hears, sees, smells, tastes, or feels something that other people don't. It's not an external reality. So if I'm hearing voices that you don't hear, and I think they're coming from the door, then I'm hallucinating. The difficulty is that psychiatrists often don't distinguish between hallucinations and visions. So there's where a lot of misunderstanding comes in when it comes to these types of medicines. Heightened sensory awareness often occurs with ayahuasca. People often describe having night vision. Most of the ayahuasca ceremonies in the indigenous areas are done at night.
And they're done with no fire. The campfire is put out because people's visual perception is very heightened, and if you have light, it can distract and also be upsetting. And it's as if you don't need the light because you can see very well in the dark, and this is true in the middle of the jungle where there's no lights whatsoever. And third is visions. And I don't have enough time to go into it today, but I would like to emphasize there is this profound, distinct difference between hallucination and visions. So what is the content of these ayahuasca visions? Well, oftentimes people experience information from their own personal past, autobiographical information, or perhaps even the experience of someone else. Some people see human beings, visions of other people. They see plants and animals, and these may talk to you. My first trip to Ecuador was in 1997. My now wife, then woman I just met, was also on the trip, and during her ayahuasca experience, she had an experience of the plants in the jungle starting to speak to her. Not only speaking to her, but affected her. She started to not be able to breathe. She felt like she was suffocating. And the plants in the jungle told her, you're going to be okay. We're doing this to you. We want you to see what it feels like to have your lungs cut out, because that's what's happening to us here in the jungle. Your people are coming down and cutting down the rainforest. They're the lungs of the earth. And if you cut down the rainforest, there's no lungs. She said, okay, just give me my breath back. I'll go home and tell everybody. So they had the ability to communicate with plants and or animals. Many people see jaguars or other plants, jungle animals, and are able to communicate with them. Some people may see mythological creatures, gnomes, all kinds of unusual things. And other people may see buildings or whole cities or landscapes. So the kinds of things you might see, with the exception maybe of the mythological creatures that you might see in your everyday life. Also, sometimes people see historical events or scenes. One of the things I saw when I drank with my son is I went back in his life and saw when his mother and I divorced. He was about 5 or 6 years old at the time. And he said to me, well, first of all, when I saw what he was experiencing when his mother and I went through the divorce, I didn't just see it, I experienced it from his viewpoint. I saw how lonely he was, how scared he was, how terrified he was to be going through this divorce. And it was heart-wrenching. Intellectually, I understood what he was going through. As a psychiatrist, I could emotionally empathize with what he'd gone through, but to experience it for myself was very different to me. So the next day after our first ayahuasca session, he said, Dad, what did you see last night? And so I told him, I said, Jordan, I saw what it was like for you as a child to go through this divorce and how painful it was. And he burst into tears and he said, Dad, I've just been waiting for someone to understand this for so long. And it was a profound healing for him, even though he didn't drink the ayahuasca that night. Interestingly enough, the second night when we drank again, I saw absolutely nothing, and he had profound visions. So same medicine, same location, just different experiences. Visions of the divine. People will often see a bright light, spiritual or divine images. Journeys above the earth. People will often travel way out of this solar system, out of the galaxy, through the universe on ayahuasca. And people often have the ability to see inside others' bodies. They call it X-ray vision. You may be able to look inside of someone and see what's going on inside of their body and tell them, this is where you need healing. And the shamans will often use the medicine this way. They will take ayahuasca themselves. They don't just give it to individuals usually. They will ingest it themselves so they can see into the person and see what type of healing they need. And they're often given the instructions for what the healing should be. And also scenes of birth and death are quite common with ayahuasca. It's why it's called the vine of death sometimes. I was going to put that on the title for today's talk, but I was discouraged from doing that. I thought it might scare people off. It doesn't actually kill people physically. Emotional changes that go along with ayahuasca. It can be a very different experience at different times. At times people experience tremendous fear with their ayahuasca sessions. They see things that are unpleasant, uncomfortable, frightening. At other times it can be ecstatic. I've talked with folks who said it was the most powerful, profound, spiritual, ecstatic experience I've ever had. Oftentimes people experience feelings of profound peace or love, just as Robert was talking about the unconditional love he experienced. The same kind of thing can happen with ayahuasca. But I wouldn't recommend you go drink ayahuasca just for the experience of love, because you might have one of the other experiences as well, and there's no predicting. Cognitive changes are quite frequent with ayahuasca. Often there's a new understanding of one's own background and how it's affected one's life. And again, maybe not for yourself, only for yourself, but for others as well. People often describe a sense of cosmic consciousness. Are people familiar with that term? It was coined by a psychiatrist, Canadian psychiatrist around the early 1900s, Maurice Buck, who wrote a book about cosmic consciousness, a profound state of altered consciousness that at that time he thought there were a couple dozen people in the world who'd experienced it. Well, now it's becoming much more common. It's the sort of thing that many people with near-death experiences experience. Intuitive knowledge is quite common. People can suddenly know things that weren't arrived at rationally. The dualistic mind doesn't provide this information. It's a sudden knowing that you can't often explain. You just know things an expanded knowledge. You may see things from a different perspective. It's like taking a broader view of your own life, perhaps. And an increased awareness of synchronicities. Synchronicities, Carl Jung used the term to describe meaningful coincidences, things that may look like a coincidence from one perspective. When you see a bigger picture, they have a deeper meaning. Transcendent experiences are common with ayahuasca. People have a sense of unity. They're one with everything around them. In the jungle, you may feel connected with the plants, the animals, the other people you're with. People often transcend space and time. As I mentioned, I could travel back and forth in my son's timeline. Very interesting. He's 23 now and just headed for Australia next month. And I'm curious. When I saw his life, I saw the house he would live in. I would see his children. I saw the gender of his children as they were being born. And I'm just curious to see now, as this plays out, how accurate my visions were of his future. Noesis is a Greek term that means intuitive knowledge. It's the best translation we have for it. And again, the profound peace and joy that people experience or can experience with ayahuasca is amazing. I have a friend in Denver, a psychiatrist, who went down to Ecuador, or to Peru actually, and drank ayahuasca. And she came back, she was just overflowing with a sense of love and happiness. She said it was the most profound experience she'd ever had. Often there's a feeling of sacredness about the experience. I have to this day, still never heard of anybody abusing ayahuasca. And I don't think it's just because of the vomiting and diarrhea. It's a very powerful medicine, and people don't seem to have a desire just to go out and drink it and drink it and drink it. If they're going to drink frequently, it's usually done in a religious or spiritual context. There's a sense of paradoxicality, meaning that things that may have appeared opposite or dualistic in the past suddenly are resolved into a single underlying unity. And ineffability. These experiences often cannot be described in words. They're just beyond words for many people. So these are the general phenomena of ayahuasca experiences as described by Dr. Shannon and others. So now I want to move on to near-death experiences. And those of you who are here are very familiar with these. Bruce Grayson, who they mentioned, is retired. I didn't know he retired. Is the University of Virginia, one of the leading researchers in near-death experiences, and just defined a near-death experience as a profound subjective event with transcendental or mystical elements that many people experience on the threshold of death. That's true. There's now a description also of NDE-like experiences where people are not on the threshold of death and have experiences that are very similar to a near-death experience. I will just mention that one of those individuals had an NDE-like experience, my first trip to Ecuador in 1997, and I believe it probably resulted from the work I did with the shamans, although I still don't know for sure. And it was interesting to me that as I was having this very profound mystical spiritual experience, I drank the ayahuasca, and the ayahuasca shut down the experience for about 24 hours. The feelings of energy, of transcendence that I was experiencing were gone for not quite 24 hours, less than a day, and they came back again. So I think in that context, it probably wasn't the right time for me to drink ayahuasca. Just wasn't familiar enough with it to know. Raymond Moody, who is a psychiatrist, wrote the first book. This is the one I gave my grandfather, 1975, a book called Life After Life, where he interviewed people that had been close to death and described their experiences phenomenologically. He came up with the term near-death experiences. Initially, he sort of distilled out 15 common elements of these experiences. Later, he distilled those down to 9 elements, and I wanted to show you what those are. First one is a sense of being dead. People often, when they're close to death, suddenly realize something's different, something's wrong, maybe they're dead. They sense peace and painlessness. My grandfather's peace was so profound he didn't want to come back. People feel that they've left their bodies. They often go through a tunnel in this culture. In other cultures, people are not so likely to report a tunnel. Sometimes they describe a void or a barrier or something else that they cross. They often encounter people of light and a being of light. They often experience a review of their life history, often simultaneously. It's as if there's a 3D panoramic view of their life they experience all at once. They have an experience of rapidly rising into the heavens, and they are very reluctant to come back. They don't want to come back. It's much better on the other side. In addition, with near-death experiences, people often say that time and space are very different. Either they don't exist or they exist differently. They observe things that happen in different places. Maybe if they're in the emergency room at the hospital, they may hear conversations down the hall or on another floor of the hospital. Some people even leave the hospital and see their family back home and how they're reacting. And finally, traveling by thought alone. People only need to think of a place and they're there instantaneously oftentimes, or they often say they travel faster than the speed of light. So what similarities are there between Moody's 9 core elements of the near-death experience and ayahuasca phenomena? Well, this first is the sense of being dead. It's interesting because although Moody described that as first element, he also said that many people don't realize they're dead at first. They think that something is very different is going on, but they don't know quite what. Tony Sikoria is an orthopedic surgeon who was at last year's conference. I unfortunately don't think he's here this time. But Tony was at a family reunion in upstate New York when he got hit by lightning. He was talking on a telephone, and lightning hit the wire and came through and electrocuted him. And as he describes, he was trying to get everyone's attention after this because everybody was working over there on something, and he said, "Hey guys, I'm over here, I'm fine." And he realized it was his body they were working on. And then since they wouldn't listen or pay attention to him, he decided to go on up the stairs. That he was in a basement, go up and go outside. Well, as he was going up the stairs, he started seeing his legs dissolving, he said. And he knew that something was wrong at that point. And then as he kept going, he went right through the wall of the house, then he realized something was really wrong. So again, people initially sometimes have a hard time recognizing that they're dead. People who drink ayahuasca often feel separated from bodies. It's very easy to feel that separation. And that may be very confusing if it's their first time or if they're not familiar with this type of experience. But they don't necessarily think they're dead. It's not the first assumption for many people, although many people do think, "I'm dying with ayahuasca." A feeling of peace is very common both with near-death experiences and with ayahuasca once you get through the initial difficult physical phase. Out-of-body experiences are frequent with near-death experiences. In South America, they often talk about flights of the soul is the term, as opposed to out-of-body experience. But it's very common with ayahuasca, and people use those flights of the soul to travel and to gain information. The tunnel or void, again, with near-death experiences, we talk a lot about a tunnel because that's what Moody talked about initially, but many people I've talked with who had near-death experiences said they did not actually go through a tunnel, but they did have some barrier or that they crossed or some void they went through. And with ayahuasca, people often describe a period of a void that they travel through. The fifth core feature of Moody's people of light. As I mentioned with my grandfather, he saw a being of light that he during his near-death experience. Many people on ayahuasca also will encounter spirits of the dead. That they talk with relatives, family members, loved ones who come back to help them and guide them. There's also a very bright light often with ayahuasca. People who are in the jungle say, again, not only do they have night vision, but it's like everything has a light within it. The plants, the other people, they see a light. And then lastly, in both experiences, people often communicate via thought transfer. They don't use words out loud. They just need, through their thoughts, they're able to communicate both with near-death experiences and with ayahuasca. A being of light is commonly encountered during near-death experiences, but not always. And with ayahuasca experiences, people often encounter guides. And those guides or teachers may take many forms. They may take the form of an animal or a plant or a disembodied being. And again, these may have a divine aspect to them as well. The life review is quite common, but not universal with near-death experiences. And with ayahuasca, people are able, if they choose to, or sometimes have the experience of seeing their own life or the life of someone else. So these are very common. Rising rapidly to the heavens, very common with both near-death experiences and ayahuasca. And the last one, a reluctance to return to life. For some reason, this is much more common with near-death experiences than with ayahuasca. I've not heard anyone describe or see anything written about people on ayahuasca not wanting to come back unless they're feeling physically uncomfortable, just wanting this experience to end. But typically it's not an issue, and I think it's because people expect to come back. With near-death experiences, people are often so happy on the other side that they just don't want to come back, and they feel such a profound sense of peace and love. So to summarize the similarities, what you can see is there are many, many similarities between near-death experiences and ayahuasca experiences, with the exception maybe of the sense of being dead and the reluctance to return. So now what I want to do is flip the tables. We've been comparing ayahuasca experiences to Moody's 9 core experiences. I want to flip and look at it now from Shannon's perspective. So if you look at the ayahuasca phenomena, how often do these occur with near-death experiences? Well, with perceptual changes, with the exception of hallucinations, they're very common to both experiences. Hallucinations don't typically occur with near-death experiences, I would say. The difficulty here is how we define hallucinations and how we define visions. And we don't in psychiatry. We don't define visions, and we pretend like they don't exist, and so there's no way to distinguish them. That's an error that needs to be remedied. Emotional changes are very similar. There are frightening near-death experiences. Most often, the ones we hear about, and often at the conferences here, we hear about people's ecstatic, euphoric, wonderful experiences. But there can be very frightening near-death experiences as well sometimes. And with ayahuasca, some people have very frightening experiences. It's interesting though, and this can happen both with near-death experiences and ayahuasca, these experiences can change. It can start out very frightening and then turn into an ecstatic experience. or it could be an ecstatic experience that goes through a frightened period that people will move through it back into ecstasy again. So it's not just one type of emotional experience with either one, but they're more fluid than that and intermixed. Cognitive changes with ayahuasca are very similar to what you see with near-death experiences. And the transcendent features are also very common. When talking with people who've had ayahuasca experiences with these features, it sounds just like they've had a near-death experience. I will say that right now, along with a friend, Joe Tafur, who's a Colombian physician who lives in Phoenix, Arizona, but spends about 6 months in Peru working with a Shipibo shaman, we're doing a study right now looking at the mystical elements of ayahuasca experiences. We're collecting questionnaires from people who've gone through ayahuasca sessions and asking them about the mystical aspects of their experience. We hope to gather that data and publish it.
What was his name?
Joe Tafur, T-A-F-U-R. And if you want to get you some more information about his center in Peru and his email address, he's a real good, solid guy who's doing a lot of personal work and hard work down there to be trained as an ayahuasquero or someone who administers ayahuasca. So there are many similarities. What about differences? Well, there are some differences between near-death experiences and ayahuasca. For example, many people with near-death experiences try looking back at their bodies and seeing them. That's less common with ayahuasca. I mean, it probably happens, but it's not commonly described. I'm finding that others cannot hear them. That's quite common with NDEers who've just left their bodies and separated. As I mentioned, Tony Secoria tried to contact people and they wouldn't hear him. With ayahuasca, that doesn't seem to be as common. The tunnel phenomenon is more common with near-death experiences than it is with ayahuasca. And as I mentioned earlier, the reluctance to return to life. On the other hand, there's some things that happen more commonly with ayahuasca, such as seeing geometric patterns, having seen mythological creatures, genies, gnomes. That's more common with ayahuasca, not so common with near-death experiences. And visions of the jungle, probably because that's often where it's ingested. Although I have had people who ingest it in other locations, say, even like in the United States, where they're not in a jungle setting, then often they'll still see visions of the jungle. So, I'll start pulling things together. So, discussion. Rick Strassman is a psychiatrist. He was at the University of Mexico. I believe he's retired now. Over a decade ago, he suggested that DMT, the chemical that's the active ingredient in ayahuasca, may be released in the pineal gland in the brain when people die or come close to death, and perhaps this is what causes near-death experiences. It's an interesting proposal because it would help explain why ayahuasca and near-death experiences are so similar. However, Strassman, he even wrote a book that I think is in the bookstore, unless they're sold out of it, called DMT, the Spirit Molecule.
It is sold out.
It is sold out. Sorry, you can get it online or Amazon though if you're interested in reading more about DMT. So he really believed that it was DMT that was responsible for triggering near-death experiences. Later, he abandoned this idea, however, because he felt that themes of death and dying were missing from many ayahuasca experiences. So he thought there must be more to it than this. Now, I'd like to talk next about some of the challenges we have in trying to research near-death experiences. For those who are interested in research, it's a difficult area to study because you can't do prospective studies for near-death experiences, or it's very difficult to do them. You can't set someone up and then have them have a near-death experience and study it while they're going through it. And so you also really can't induce near-death experiences. If you get in trouble with IRBs and institutional review boards and universities if you induce near-death experiences. And also, it's very difficult to do brain imaging scans on people while they're dying. I mean, it's just considered not a kosher thing to do. So it makes it difficult, and I think it's part of the reason we haven't had more substantial research done on near-death experiences. It's hard to study them when they're happening. But ayahuasca provides us an opportunity, I believe, to look at some of the phenomena that occur both during ayahuasca sessions and near-death experiences. If someone is on ayahuasca and they're having an out-of-body experience, you can do a brain scan on them at that time. You can measure certain physiological measurements. You can do things to try to understand what's the correlation, if any, with what's going on within their body and their brain with their experience. Now, having said this, I have to play devil's advocate and say this may be totally fruitless. Along with a couple of friends, Skip Morgan, who's here, a physicist on the other side, Skip and I and a couple of other friends have been trying to do some research on consciousness. And one of our ideas was to invite our friend Rafael Yamburlu, who's the shaman from Ecuador, to help us. And Rafael has many unique gifts, one of which is to be able to diagnose someone from a photograph. And I've seen him do this many times. He can look at a photograph of someone and he can tell us exactly what's wrong with them and details about their lives. And I say, Rafael, how do you do this? And he says, I don't know, it's just a gift that's in my family. He said that since I was a little boy I could do this. And so we decided to do an experiment with Rafael. We took him to a local neurology office in Colorado Springs and we wired him to an EEG. And we had several pictures of people that we knew, family members, friends, and we knew what their diagnoses were. And so we began showing Raphael these pictures, and we were monitoring his EEG. It just so happened the EEG tech was a Native American woman whose brother's a medicine man. And she was sort of laughing at us. She said, "You're not going to see anything." And sure enough, Raphael was able to accurately tell us what was going on with these people, but there were no changes in his EEG. So it was a negative study. So does that mean nothing's happening? No, it just means the EEG didn't record how he was able to do this.
What's Raphael's last name?
Yamberla, Yamberla. If you're interested in reaching him, I can give you his contact information. So there are opportunities, but there are also challenges. But at least we may be able to do prospective studies with ayahuasca where we can't do them with near-death experiences. And in fact, some brain imaging studies are possible and are being done. Jordi Riba, a researcher, recorded EEGs on 18 volunteers who were given ayahuasca. And what they found is that basically the ayahuasca decreased the power density in all bands on the EEG. In other words, the brain activity was decreased. The EEG measures electrical activity in the brain. So with ayahuasca, the brain just sort of quiets down. There's also the potential for PET and MRI scans. These are different ways of imaging the brain and understanding what it looks like and how it's functioning. These kinds of studies have already been done with other psychedelic medicines like psilocybin, which is a psychedelic mushroom that's often used. So these studies are possible, and it may give us some insights into what happens during near-death experiences. And my contention here is that we need to do more research because so often we're making guesses as to what's going on. But if we can do research and understand what's happening with ayahuasca, it may give us information that may guide us and learn more about what happens during near-death experiences. And it's not to try to explain them away, saying that there's a chemical that causes near-death experiences. My personal belief is that near-death experiences and ayahuasca experiences occur at many different levels. There is a physiological chemical level to ayahuasca. But does DMT explain everything? No, it doesn't explain how my son and I were able to have healing in the jungle. I don't think everybody that takes DMT is going to have that kind of experience. It doesn't explain how I can see what happens in his life forward and back. It doesn't explain how someone with a near-death experience leaves their body and goes into a light and comes back healed, like Anita Morjani, for those of you who were here at last year's conference. Anita was a woman who was suffering from severe terminal cancer, and during her near-death experience went into the light and learned that she needed to come back and she could be healed, and she went through a spontaneous remission of her cancer. I don't think a release of DMT in her pineal gland caused that healing. But there are opportunities to learn more about these phenomena so that we can learn from them. And that's the last slide. So we have a little bit of time left. I'd be willing to open it up for questions, discussion.
I understand,
Yes.
I understand from listening to you on the NDE radio thing that you're actually licensed to give DMT to people.
No, that is not true.
Okay.
I think that, I don't remember if Lee said that or not, but there's no one that I'm aware of that's licensed to give DMT to people in this country. It's a Schedule I substance. It would be very, very difficult.
Because I know that's what Strassman did at some point.
At one point he did, yeah. He was actually administering DMT.
Right.
But the difficulty has been, politically, working with psychedelic medicines has been a political hot potato. Pretty much all research was shut down for really since the 70s. In the last few years that has changed. There are studies going on right now with several psychedelic medicines, with psilocybin mushrooms, with LSD in Switzerland. There's been some work. MDMA, Charles Grove at UCLA is doing a study now with MDMA and high-functioning autism. So the political climate has changed enough that now there is beginning to be some research, although there was just an opportunity at the University of Arizona at Tucson. One of the researchers there was finally granted permission to do some studies with medical marijuana. And as soon as she received the final approval, she was fired by the university, putting the studies on hold. So it's still a very politically charged issue.
Although you did say that UVD churches sometimes are giving it, and so if we don't want to go all the way to Ecuador, we have some, like we did with the research that way.
Yes. To my knowledge, like I said, there are 3 Brazilian churches that use it legally. The Supreme Court ruled that the use of ayahuasca in the religious setting, like in the UDV church, is similar to Native Americans using peyote in Native American ceremonies. So in that context, you can use it. The difficulty may be the UDV church is trying to keep a pretty low profile to not stir up trouble. But there are churches where you can become a member and drink ayahuasca and become a member of the church. Yes?
I will be forgiving medicine actually relatively soon.
Got it.
And I was wondering, I've gotten all
I'll repeat.
of my a medication? Is there anything else I should do to optimize my experience?
Yes, I'll repeat for those who couldn't hear it. The young lady said that she's going to be participating with the medicine soon and wondered if there was anything she should do to prepare herself. I didn't go into this, but because of the chemical nature of this medicine with the monoamine oxidase inhibitors, it can, at least theoretically, interact with other medicines, especially some prescription medicines, antidepressant medicines as well as others, and in theory could cause something called a hypertensive crisis where your blood pressure goes up through the roof. So it is important before you take ayahuasca that you consult with someone who's knowledgeable in this area. There have even been some deaths reported recently in South America, just a few. Unfortunately, it's usually in situations where it's believed that there's an unethical person administering the medicine. For example, there was a young man from Northern California who was, I don't remember, he was 18 or 19 years old, that went down and disappeared. He went down to drink ayahuasca. They found his body in the jungle, and apparently the so-called shaman or healer was taking money from tourists, giving them ayahuasca, and then not watching over them. And they found him dead, so they just dumped his body in the jungle. So that's not common, but there are risks, and I want to caution you. I mean, many people will travel to Peru where there's a whole business of an ayahuasca tourism where people go just to drink ayahuasca. But I know the psychiatrist friend I mentioned from Boulder who went down, she did one of these, and the shaman she worked with administered the ayahuasca, and he went up to his house to watch Spanish soap operas. And he said he was keeping an eye on them remotely. Don't do that. If you hear those kind of stories, don't go work with that. The responsible shamans, the true ayahuasqueros, will sit with you. They will drink ayahuasca with you, and they will monitor you, and they can even stop the experience if it's uncomfortable. They have ways of stopping the experience if you're having any problems with it. So I think, to prepare yourself, sometimes there will be diets beforehand. The shaman will guide you in that. You may need to fast for a day, usually only a day. They may want you to fast or avoid certain foods after the experience. I think there can be a lot of spiritual work done in preparation. I think the intention that you go in with is critical to the experience. So even taking a few days to focus on what your intention is with the session, to clear your mind. Some people will meditate for several days beforehand or even longer. But clarifying intention, I think, is very critical. And I think the most important thing now is probably to research who you're going to be using it with and make sure it's a responsible experienced
So if
person.
a bipolar schizoaffective daughter on 8 meds and methadone, it would be very wise to prep her with the shaman or not take her at all.
I probably wouldn't take her. There is an ayahuasca forum where there's an email forum among ayahuasca researchers that have recently been discussing. There have been several instances of young people who are bipolar who were triggered into a manic state with ayahuasca. So it may end up being one of the contraindications of ayahuasca is if you have bipolar disorder. Also, you don't probably want to go off your meds if you're bipolar.
I think we ought to think about too how Western meds are killing a lot of people too.
Absolutely, many more, and that's my contention. And we talk about 1 or 2 or 3 people, which is a tragedy, dying of ayahuasca. We have tens of thousands of young people dying from narcotic overdoses, heroin overdoses, alcohol overdoses in this country. So it's not that the medicine's a bad medicine. It's like any medicine, it needs to be used appropriately. Thank you. Yes.
Have you personally taken acid, and if so, can you compare it, or have you talked to anybody that has and would compare the experience?
Yeah, I've taken acid once many years ago under the supervision of a psychologist. So that was my setting. I was at my therapist's house. He thought I needed it. He thought I was a little too uptight. Right. The experience for me was a bit overwhelming. It was, and again, that's my one experience. It was overwhelming, visual imagery, went on for hours, and it was just a flood. With the ayahuasca, again, I drank it 3 times. The first experience was very uncomfortable for me. I was in the midst of this, I'll call it a kundalini experience for lack of a better term, a very profound experience. And that time I drank ayahuasca, I was having uncontrollable convulsions in my body, not seizures, but my body, I had this energy that was shaking me so hard I couldn't stop it. It wasn't pleasant, and the imagery was not helpful. The second time I drank it, it was very profound with my son. I saw images of his future, it was a very healing experience. And the third time I drank it, I saw nothing happened. So it's hard to compare with LSD because every one of my experiences was so different. And I think even if people have had hundreds of experiences, it may be very different. Did you have a follow-up question?
Yeah, I guess I'm asking because back in the 60s, I took acid a little bit, and I didn't like it.
Yeah.
And I didn't find any sense of mystical stuff for me, and I'm an MDE experiencing. And I didn't feel any ability to control it. And of course, I was younger then and probably not in the greatest setting. So this fascinates me, but my concern would be, I wouldn't want to have another experience like that, and there's no guarantee of what kind of experience you're going to have.
That's correct.
So and I think intention has everything to do with it, but like you said, you didn't on either one, there's times when it wasn't comfortable.
Oh, yeah, there are times it's not
Yeah,
comfortable.
so you have to be willing, I guess.
Yes, I think the setting is critical to the experience. I think years of research from the 60s have taught people that with any psychedelic medicine. So I think it is unpredictable. I know if some of you need to leave, I'll be glad to answer questions, but yes, the gentleman in the back.
Yeah, only 2 questions. Can anybody drink weed?
I'm sorry?
Anybody drink weed?
Can anybody drink it? It's up to the Ayahuasca or the shaman to decide, but I have a good friend who's a psychiatrist, and he asked, can I drink ayahuasca? And the shaman said, oh no, you're not ready. You need a few years of work on yourself first, meditation, so it depends on the ayahuasca.
Second question is,
Sure.
have you seen permanent effects, side effects, permanent side effects?
Have I seen permanent side effects from ayahuasca? I have not personally not heard of any, other than if you consider death to be a side effect. I think it may have been misadministered. Also, there are psychotic reactions, rarely, but those, to my knowledge, all of those people have improved over time and the psychosis is resolved.
Because I hear a friend's friend that has stayed in the hallucination
Yes.
for a long time, for years. I don't know how many he drink.
Yes.
Drunk, but he's still in the trip.
Yes.
Say, or
The treatment, yeah. You know, I don't know. I was taught in medical school, the only difference between a medicine and a poison is the dose. So if people take too much of anything, it's not safe. That's where you need the guidance of an experienced ayahuasquero to say when you're ready, how much, how often,
Yeah.
to guide you, not someone who just passed
What's
it
a
on.
poison for me could be a medicine for you.
Yes, yes, go ahead.
My training for the last 20 years has been in the shamanic journey without sacred medicine. And I'm wondering if you have known anyone who's done both. The thing I liked about the way that I've been trained is that if I have a bad journey, I can sit up and get out of it. With the ayahuasca, you're there, or any of the other sacred medicines, you're there until the medicine is done with you. And that's not true?
That's not true.
Oh.
In both of my experiences working with a Shuar shaman and a Quechua shaman, they informed me that if at any time it was uncomfortable or more than I could handle, let me know and they'd stop the experience. And so I think that if you're working with a reputable person, if they will be with you, they travel with you and keep an eye on you to make sure you're doing okay.
Never mind.
We got one more question, and then we got to wrap it up.
Okay, Mel hasn't had a chance.
People in ayahuasca report visions of things that they say they've never seen before. How is it possible to see something that is completely out of your reference point?
I guess it's the same as having an idea or a dream that you've never had before. I mean, our mind, if you look at it from a mind perspective, our mind can create all kinds of images that are unfamiliar to us, that may be blends of others, and maybe new creations. New ideas pop into our head all the time. And I see ayahuasca as a catalyst for those kinds of experiences. So I think we need to stop so people can have lunch. I'd be glad to stick around and talk though if people have other questions or share more. Thank you.